welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here from some outer space, it feels. So I'm going to talk today about why humans fight. And I have a couple of slides, not as beautiful as you just saw them, because it was explicitly asked to keep it simple. I will try to keep it simple for you today. All right, but first let's start with, I should put this on, that's simple. Some optimism. A few years ago, actually about 10 years ago, Steven Pinker, a professor at Harvard University, published this book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And in that book, he had a huge expose with all kinds of data suggesting that, and unequivocally so it seemed, that over the course of human history, we get less and less violent. And that wars, as we had them in the past, with thousands and thousands of people being killed, would be at some point indeed the past, and that the future actually would look pretty bright. No more wars. So was his prophecy. And slightly less broad is a book by Rutger Bregman, a Dutch historicus, and he wrote this book about why that most people are actually good. We're good. We pay our taxes without complaints. We buy a ticket for the railway or for the parking. We are actually very good law-abiding citizens. And again, it seems that this may have been increasingly so over the course of human history. So again, there is a reason for optimism. It may be that in the not-too-distant future we are all good and peaceful and war is well behind us. And yet, it's only a few months ago that a quite devastating war broke out in the Ukraine, with Russia invading, and we've seen the destruction in Mariupol. We have seen the destruction elsewhere in the Ukraine. We have seen some other things typical of wars both today and in our deeper past. We see refugees, we see famine, we see epidemics because of the refugees, because people move, they bring diseases. But we also see an increasing urge for technological innovations, not necessarily the ones that bring peace, but certainly we see innovations as well. So with war, we see a lot of things trickling down, and already with the war in Ukraine, we also see already these domino effects, where the harvests fail, and other parts of the world are actually facing famine, and we know that famine in and of itself is a good reason for political protest, uproar, and again, local violence as well. So we can see a trickling, spreading effect of one war can actually create a rippling effect elsewhere in the world. Now, it may be that the war in the Ukraine is one of these last wars that Pinker talked about. Maybe it is indeed one of those few that we still have to go through before we are actually at Pinker's prophecy, a peaceful world. And it may also be that all these atrocities that we now see in the Ukraine are actually committed by those very few people who are not good, despite the majority, according to Bregman, that is good. I cannot exclude that possibility. This one single case, if you want, this one war, is no reason to doubt the prophecy that the world is slowly evolving into a more peaceful coexistence. And still, despite these prophecies, we do have these wars, and we will have them again. Perhaps not as frequent as in the past, we will have them again. And even one war already is one too many, many would argue. So how does it go in the past? If we go in our deeper past, it looks like humans have always been fighting. And we have always been attacking each other and always needed to defend each other or to defend ourselves against these aggressive enemies. And here you see a map. It's not so clear, but it's the world map basically. And you see all kinds of areas where, from prehistoric excavations, from archaeological evidence, where it is clear that people were buried and they had marks of violence, violent trauma. So their skulls have been crushed, their bones have been broken. You see evidence of arrows sticking in their chest. These people have been killed. And of course, the archaeological evidence is very minor and you can debate it. But as you can see, there are many sites across the world, all dating over 30 to 40,000 years ago. And it's undeniable that there has been quite substantial violence of one group against another group of humans in that deep past. And I give you one example here, if you can see that. This is a mass burial, and it's not too far from here. It's in Wassenaar, down south at the coast. And you see here the skeletons of 12 people. And these are children, and these are women, and a few men. And these archaeologists who found this mass burial also found that these are not the same family. These are people from a sort of a village, a local settlement. And all 12, the children, the women, and the men, have physical trauma, clearly evidence of violence. They have been violently killed, most likely in a raid, an attack by a neighboring village. So already, also here in the Netherlands, roughly 4,000 years ago, we were fighting each other. Now, perhaps Pinker is right that things get better over the centuries. But even if we look at what happens here, is again a world map, and I cannot see it very well. Perhaps you can? Probably not, huh? Well, believe me, this again is the world. So here we see Europe, and here we see Africa. You can actually see it a little bit. And here we see Australia, and we see Asia, and this is the United States and South Latin America. And all these dots are international conflicts between two states, one state attacking the other, because the attacker state wants the other, who needed to defend itself, to change. It wanted its territory, it wanted better trade agreements, it wanted a policy change of whatever kind, and used violence to enforce that. So it attacked the other country, its neighboring country. So the United States has been, over the past 200 years, involved in quite some of these conflicts. But in Europe, it has been a complete mess, as you can see. And in Africa also. And it seems that Africa may not be so many, but it's also not always that well documented. Not every conflict that we have is that well documented. These here are 2,000 dots. That is 2,000 international conflicts that involved violence over the last 200 years. And in that sense, the war in the Ukraine is just another example of what has been happening time and again over the past 200 years, actually over the entire course of human existence. Now, if you think about that, we already get to one very clear answer to the question why humans fight. And the first immediate answer is to survive, to protect yourself and your kin and kith, your sisters, your brothers, your children, to the violence imposed on you by some aggressor. That's why we fight. We fight back. We have to defend ourselves. That's very easy, very straightforward. It's actually a bit of a boring answer. Although it's very important, and we all do it, and we all have to do it from time to time, it's not that of a deep insight. It's not that curious, actually. What I do find curious, and where we do not have yet a very good answer to, is why do humans aggress? Why do they attack? So if we have to defend from time to time, it must be that there is also a human or a group of humans who aggresses us from time to time. Some of us are the Ukraine, but from time to time we also are the Russians. Some of us are the French or the Dutch, and some of us are the Germans, but sometimes we flip roles. Sometimes we are the defenders, that's why we fight, to survive, to protect ourselves. But that requires us also being on the aggressive side, also wanting to use violence to impose our will upon someone else. And the question is, why do we do that? And that, I think, is an important question, because if we answer that question, if we know why people aggress others, why they attack others in groups, then perhaps we also understand better why we go to war, why we have to defend, and perhaps whether Pinker is right or not. That is, whether we will at some point learn to not fight, not aggress. So why humans start and support aggressive attacks? That's the question I spend the next 10 minutes on. The way we do this in our academic research is to basically say, okay, we have conflict dynamics, and I talked about attack and defense, and this can go in some flows, an attack and then the defender maybe attack back, and so there may be some dynamic, and at the end of that there are consequences. And I already gave you some of the examples: destruction, killings, rape, famine. all these consequences that I talked about. And we tend to classify these consequences as economic consequences, money wasted, social consequences. I give you a few examples of those later. And biological or biopsychological consequences. What happens to our health, what happens to our brain, our body, when we are exposed to conflict or have gone through fighting. Trauma, physical trauma, post-traumatic stress syndrome are things that we all have heard about and regularly see. But we also can think about what is it that leads to attack and therefore defense. What are the economic, the social, and perhaps the biological causes or triggers or catalysts of our tendency to get together and to aggress and attack and impose and exploit other humans. And it's this what we need to identify in order to understand where these bad consequences that we've all seen now come from. I will return to this bottom part towards the end of my talk, where I will show you that some of the consequences of conflict can actually, over time, over generations, turn into causes of conflict. And I will show you how that could work. So how do we do this? In our research, we use a couple of methods and techniques, and some of them I will use also in the talk today. So in part of our research, we use game theory, and it's a kind of an applied mathematics where we clearly model in very precise terms what the consequences are of certain actions for the outcomes that the parties get. Whether you attack or not, how much will that give you, depending on whether the other defends or not. Very basic, very mathematical, very abstract also. But it gives us a very good tool to understand the basic dynamics of conflicts as they may occur either between two individuals or between small groups or even perhaps between nation states. So it's a very abstract model and still it can be very useful. And whether that model that we then have actually predicts behavior is something that we try to understand using a variety of other techniques. So we use laboratory experiments where large numbers of people come together, are organized in groups and allowed to fight each other. And basically that fighting is over money, so it's not real violence involved. Although I have seen my participants sometimes shouting at each other. I have seen them sweating when they came out because it was involving. But of course, it doesn't really become dangerous as we have in real conflicts. We even can look into people's brains while they are in such experimental conflict models. We can identify what the brain is trying to compute and where the brain responds to and where in the brain things may happen. And then finally, because these behaviors that we observe in the laboratory are only very short in time, we cannot really see what happens over longer time courses, over millennia if you want. We also use computer simulations in which we model what agents or individuals do, and these agents, we can let them die, we can let them reproduce, what real humans also can do, but not in our laboratory. That doesn't pass the ethics committee. But we can sort of simulate that, and then we can still get a bit of an understanding of what being on the attacker side and being successful or not can do to you and your offspring over generations and generations, and how then humans, like these agents, might actually start to look like after thousands and thousands of years of fighting each other. That is how we basically approach the question, why do humans aggress others? Why do humans use their resources, risk their own lives to attack, aggress, and exploit others? Now, one very important reason that comes out of this game theory is what we could call opportunistic reasons. Humans fight because there is something to gain. There might be something in there. And I gave you a few examples with these pictures down here. So we have slaves, and slaves are simply the outcome of conflict where you are successfully subordinating another tribe, another people, and then you sell them for money. So that's good, because you win, you go out there, you win the conflict, you subordinate them, and then you can actually make a profit. That's very cynical, it sounds, but that is one of the reasons why fighting can be attractive. Another reason may be that you gain status. If you fight and you're a hero and you're seen like that, you might actually get a medal and you get honored by the people in your own tribe, in your own group, in your own city or country. And with that medal, you can be proud as a peacock and walk around. And perhaps that attracts all kind of nice things, like a nice new job, or perhaps women like you more and want to marry you, and then you can reproduce more. It's very biological, it sounds, but hey, we are just animals, aren't we? So again, maybe money or resources that you can gain, and it may be status, and that is an indirect way of gaining resources. And then finally, you may just get the cheers of your village when you return home after being an heroic fighter. And again, that may indirectly provide you with all kinds of resources. So fighting and joining the fight and participating in aggressing other groups, other countries, other villages can give you something valuable. And I call that opportunism. And whatever you may think about that, I think it is an important reason why people join aggressing others. Now, it's not without risks doing that. And as you can see here, this shows the probability, roughly 30%, that aggression is actually successful in gaining you resources. In 70% of the cases, the prediction is that you will not win the contest, that you will not win the conflict, and that you remain empty-handed as an aggressor. And this is the situation where Putin thinks, I will grab Ukraine, for a couple of euros or rubles, I will have it. And then actually, according to this model, there's only 30% chance that he's going to be successful. And in 70% of the cases, on average, over a huge amount of tryouts, if you want, the Ukraine will survive it at a huge cost, but they will not be subordinated. They will not be enslaved by Russia, by the aggressor. Now, that's what the theory would predict. And that's risky for Putin because only in 30% he will actually gain a profit on going to war, and in the other 70% of the cases he will lose. He will lose resources, he will lose manpower, he will perhaps lose his status as a dictator or a leader. So it's not without risks that he is going to do this. But if we look outside of the theory, we see actually something very similar. So we see in group hunting predators like lions or hyenas. We see it in international warfare. We see it in hostile takeovers in industry. And we see it in our laboratory, where we have little groups fighting over money with each other. And in each of these cases, we see that aggressing the other side is successful in 30% of the cases. There you enslave, there you get the profits. But in 70% of the cases, the defenders survive. Again at a cost, but they do survive. So this economic opportunism is not a given. Going to fight, going to attack is not necessarily giving you something, but if it gives you something, it can be hugely attractive. It's the gamble. And that's one reason why humans join aggression. Now, we can look at this a bit further, and that is whether that also is supported at the biological level. Now, we know from a lot of research in all kinds of animals, humans included, that this opportunistic behavior is supported by something we call testosterone. And many of you may have heard about it. Testosterone it's a sex steroid hormone that's produced in the body, and it's important for a variety of reasons. It builds your muscles. It's in males in particular, it's important for reproduction. So we have it, and what we also know is that humans who are higher on levels of testosterone, either temporarily or permanently, as like an individual, almost a personality difference, those people tend to take more risks on the financial market, for example. They are more interested in gaining and protecting their status. And what you could also then think is perhaps it is testosterone that also supports the aggressive exploitation of others. And that is indeed what research has found. Very simple. If you have lower levels of testosterone compared to higher levels, people with higher levels are more likely to initiate attacks against other groups, outgroups, so to speak. So everything else is constant here. The only difference is we have, in this case, males with somewhat lower and males with somewhat higher levels of testosterone, just natural levels of testosterone, and those with higher levels of testosterone appear to be more opportunistic in their behavior and aggress outsiders, as a way to gain money, as a way to gain status. So we see that both at the, say, cultural, but also at the biological level, this economic opportunism, if you want, is an important reason to aggress outsiders. Now, if that is the case, then we should see more aggression of outgroups, of other groups, when it is economically more rather than less important to do so, to aggress. So if aggression becomes more opportunistic, then you should see it more often. And we examined that in a particular case that I already showed you. Here is this beautiful world map where you connect the dots and we see these roughly 2,000 international conflicts. And our idea was in this case that if the countries that aggress the other country, there must be some reason that it is more economically opportunistic to do so. And if it is more opportunistic to do so, it may be because there is something to grab that you don't have yourself. For example, if your environment is a bit under stress, floodings, droughts, the climate isn't so good, or perhaps the economy isn't going so well, it may actually become opportunistic to grab the goods elsewhere. And we see this in all kinds of animals. We see this in monkeys who are hungry, and then they go into unknown territory to get food and are willing to chase away the locals there and get into fights, sometimes lethal. So we see this in monkeys, and perhaps in humans it's the same thing. So what we did was, with all these 2,000 conflicts, we looked at the aggressor and the defender state, and for each of these two states in one pair, we looked at how much stress was there in the environment 10 years before the onset of the conflict. And what we see is the following. In the aggressor states, the 10 years before the conflict, these aggressor states experienced more economic, but also climatic stress than their defenders. So if we look, for example, nowadays at Russia and Ukraine, and you never can look at one particular case, we have to look at averages. But for example, out of this comes the suggestion that Russia may have been, over the past 10 years, under some sort of environmental stress that made them feel they need to go out and aggress in order to grab the stuff to serve their own people well. And through the environmental stress, it became economically opportunistic to aggress their neighbors. So again, we see this at the biological level with testosterone. We see it in our lab studies at the behavioral level, but even we see it at the state level, at the international level, that some sort of economic opportunism explains very well why humans in groups or even in nation states aggress their neighbors. Now, we did one final experiment along these lines that I want to show you, because here we can very specifically look in an economic model what would be rational from a strict opportunistic perspective to attack. So according to this model, we should see that people in our laboratory should invest in attack almost 6. That's what the economic model predicts. Now what do people do is a little bit more. So they behave according to the theory, but a little bit, they overdo it, you could say. Now in this experiment, we created some environmental stress, and according to the model, we should then see an increase in aggression. And we could again precisely predict how much increase we should see under environmental stress when people operate as strict economic opportunists. And what we see again is that people overinvest. So environmental stress pushes up the level of aggression, as we have seen before with these countries aggressing each other under different levels of climatic and economic stress in their past. And yet there is something interesting if you look at these data very carefully. And that is that this increase here is larger than this increase here. So environmental stress increases the reason to be an opportunist, but it seems to do something else. And that something else is not huge, but it's undeniable. To us it was like, what is going on there? environmental stress seems to do something more than just increase the level of opportunism in people. And we saw that in a follow-up experiment even more. Here we have all the 3 people in one group under the exact same level of environmental stress. And these 3 people should therefore aggress to the exact same amount. And that's exactly what they do. They invest in conflict and the same. And we compared that to a scenario where the 3 people in a group were under different levels of environmental stress. One was hugely stressed, and one was almost not stressed. And according to the theory, we should see that they respond to their individual level of stress and nothing more. And indeed, we see that someone is hugely stressed aggresses the outgroup more than those who are under an intermediate level. So that works. The theory is confirmed again. But what happens if we look at those people, especially the 0-2, the one who is actually not so stressed? He should not invest in aggression because he is opportunistic, right? And this is what we find. The person in the group who is personally not under stress aggresses more than those who are together under a higher level of stress. And that's what is going on. That's the weird thing. This cannot be explained by opportunistic behavior. In no way. To us, what this could explain is that this person is somewhat, nice. He helps out his brother in arms. His brother, his fellow in the group, who is under a high level of stress. Let me help you by joining your quest to get some resources from the other side. So this is a form of self-sacrifice, perhaps, out of solidarity with this person here. And that we examined in the final set of studies that I show you here. What we now want to know is we strip away all variation in economic opportunism. And we're zooming in on solidarity, or some other regard, or some social preferences, or altruism, as some people would even call it, to try to see whether we can increase or decrease the level of altruism in people, and whether that co-varies with their aggression of other groups. And we did that in a very complicated way, or not, but here you see 6 people, 3 in a black t-shirt and 3 in a white t-shirt, and we did that deliberately. So these people came into our laboratory, and we divided them into 2 groups, 2 systems if you want. And in one system, we gave 3 people 1 colored t-shirt, black, and the other 3 white, and we had a conflict between a black and a white team. In the other system, we also had 6 people in the lab, and then we randomly gave them different colored t-shirts. 1 blue, 1 white, 1 yellow, and then we had 3 colors on this side fighting the conflict against 3 colors on the other side. So here we have the same t-shirts, little clubs, and there we don't have that. And now we know from earlier work by colleagues over the years that already giving people the same t-shirt gives them a little feeling of we belong together. We are a group. And we see that, of course, all the time. You know, you go to a club and you dress up a little bit in the way you think others will be dressed up too. We conform there a bit. And that we try to mimic here in the lab. So this is a very minimalistic way of creating some bonding amongst these people. The second thing we did was we hooked these people onto all kinds of fancy machines that could read their brains while they were actually engaging in conflict. So we create some bonding, or not, and we look at what happens in their brains while they are making investments to aggress, attack, exploit the other side. Now here are 2 things that we see. First of all, if we create some level of solidarity, having the same t-shirt versus not having the same t-shirt increases, as we expected, the level of aggression towards other groups. And here is no reason, there is no variation in economic opportunism here. Wearing the same t-shirt does not do anything to that. The only explanation is that these people here felt a little bit more solidarity with their other team members, and that solidarity led them to aggress other groups to try to get the spoils of war to share with their fellow in-group. So that's already, it's a little bit annoying, right? We wear the same t-shirt, we become more aggressive towards outsiders. But what is more telling is that we at the same time see brain activity in two areas in the brain that Steven Pinker talks about as the better angels of our nature. The ability in our brain to encode what others are going to do, what empathy for others, if you want, is strongly encoded in this temporal parietal junction. And we see that we increase solidarity in the group, we see they become more aggressive, and they have more activity in the temporal parietal junction. They also have more activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is an area in the brain that we know is involved in economic computing of costs and benefits. So we see actually that the solidarity at the brain level seems to evoke two things. First, I empathize with my group members, and we see that also in the brain. And second, I compute in an opportunistic way the cost and benefit of aggressing outsiders. So solidarity increases Pinker's better angels of our mind, but these better angels of our mind or nature are in service of exploiting another group. And this is the most beautiful graph I've ever seen, but I'll skip it because it only complicates. It shows the same thing, basically. Now I can go again one level deeper. I've shown you that there's something happening in our brain that is not so surprising because that is actually directing everything that we do. I've shown you at the behavioral level that solidarity can make you more aggressive in service of your group. But we also know that, again, hormones and all kinds of brain chemistries are involved in these kinds of behaviors. And one very famous, I would say, is the cuddle hormone or the love peptide or whatever nickname it has, oxytocin. And we know from some research that oxytocin is heavily involved, it's produced in the brain and the hypothalamus. And we know that it's heavily involved in all kinds of caring behaviors, in all kinds of animals also, humans included, but we see it in all kinds of mammals, in voles, we see it in fish even. That oxytocin or its analogs are strongly involved in two things: in solidarity towards your close others. You care for them, you want to protect them, you want them to survive and do well. And related to that is some vigilance for outside danger. So an animal who has higher levels of oxytocin has stronger care for its close others and is vigilant for possible threats from outside towards those close others, including the willingness to use aggression to protect what is so dear to you. And that is exactly where oxytocin now kicks in. It is not the cuddle hormone, it is not the love hormone, but it may be the solidarity hormone, if you want. And if that is the case, we might see that oxytocin, like testosterone earlier, is involved in a willingness to participate in aggression, in aggressing outgroups, if that gives the in-group the resources it needs to survive. And that, indeed, is the case. We have now seen through a series of studies that we and others elsewhere in the world have done. We even see it in other animals, like chimpanzees, that animals, humans included, with higher levels of oxytocin, are more likely and more willing to participate in aggressive fighting, strangers, enemies, outsiders. So like testosterone, oxytocin seems to be very much in play here. But where testosterone is supporting the economic opportunistic reasons for attacking and aggressing, oxytocin seems to be the supporting mechanism for the more caring part of aggressing outsiders. Now, Darwin, I'm a bit of a fan of his, had this great quote where he says, "Groups with a greater number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members were always ready to warn each other of danger and to aid and defend each other. They would spread and be victorious over other tribes." And what Darwin actually refers to here is that all forms of competition, including conflicts between groups, have a long-lasting effect on how that particular set of groups looks like. Simply said, the winner reproduces and the loser not. And if the winner reproduces, what makes the winner a winner also reproduces. So if the winner is strong, then its offspring will be comparatively strong. If the winner wins because it has high levels of testosterone, because somehow its body produces that in sufficient amounts, it is likely that its offspring has that same system. And that means that over generations and generations, recurring conflicts between groups operates at what evolutionary biologists would call a selection force. It selects for certain things. Now, this is a very open question in the science area that I'm delving in. But it's an interesting, perhaps also a bit disconcerting hypothesis that we fight, and that when we win the fight, what makes us a winner gets reproduced, and that what made us a loser gets eradicated. It's very simply said, very black and white, but it's interesting. And if that is the case, today I've shown you that we have opportunistic reasons supported by testosterone that promote our willingness to engage and our chances of winning an aggression. I've also shown you that solidarity is critical there and that oxytocin supports that. So these are roughly the two main reasons why humans fight and aggress others, because of opportunism, because of solidarity with their biological support mechanisms. And in 30% of the cases, we win, both mammals and mammals in my lab, human mammals. And if we take Darwin seriously, it may well be that because of this, we more likely win, and when we win, we reproduce this in our offspring. And that's the long-term consequences, that over generations and generations, we nudge each other through conflict in a particular kind of species, the species that we are today. And that is not necessarily a species that has learned to do good and that has learned to be peaceful and quiet when someone else wants something too. That's not necessarily where Pinker thinks we are going. Humans fight to survive attacks from others. Humans attack others to gain welfare and status. And they attack others to promote the welfare and well-being of their close others, of their own group. That's why humans fight. Now, humans fight also to do good, to help each other in their group. And these better angels of our nature, of Pinker, they help to aggressively and effectively attack and exploit others. It's not, in that sense, that simple or straightforward. And that means that humans are good because we fight, or because our parents and ancestors fought. The one and the other, it's just two sides of the same coin. Thank you very much.